Okay, so this is our CAA number 3 historical timeline. My name is Hannah Gage.
I'm Ashton Brown.
And I'm Sadie Gregg.
So for our first slide, we have Brown versus Board Education 1954. So just some key points. It made it to where ELL students cannot be separated fully from other students throughout their education. It made it clear that the states are responsible for the providing of equal education opportunities for students. And then this case opened the way for other high quality bilingual programs. An implication that we found was that it helped to maintain the standards of ELL education by allowing them the chance to learn amongst English proficient peers and amongst other ELLs. And then the limitation we have is that this places a lot of added pressure and stress on students to learn in 2 different environments, and this can be very confusing for many students.
Our next law was the Title VII Bilingual Education Act, and it was here from 1968 to 2002. So some of the key points are that the law was introduced by Senator Ralph Yarborough. At first, it was only applied to Spanish speakers, but eventually spread to multiple languages. And then it provided grants to school districts and anyone else who also adopted this law, any programs. Some of our implications were that it increased support for dual language programs, and it also stopped laws prohibiting the use of home language instruction in schools. And then the limitations we found were that compromises to adopt this law led to some funding for non-bilingual programs. And then at first, like I said earlier, it was only applied to Spanish speakers, not all bilingual speakers.
The next case was the Section 504 of the Vocational Rehabilitation Act of 1973. Our key points we found were that it prevented discrimination against all individuals with disabilities and programs that received federal funds as like public schools. It ensured equal opportunity for participation in full range of school activities, so they were never left out of anything. And some of the students weren't eligible for services through special ed and may have been entitled to receive specific types of assistance to help them succeed in school. Our implication that we found was maintain standards for students with disabilities and protected them from any discrimination in the school setting. And our limitation was students that did not meet the eligibility for services through the special education program did not receive as much aid outside of school as they may need it.
Okay, so we have Blau versus Nichols, 1974. So our key points for this one are that this is one of the most important court cases regarding the education of ELL students. And then this case also was a Chinese American students at California that were being placed in the classroom despite not being proficient in English. And then Lau remedies came from this case to go after districts that were ignoring the needs of ELL students. An implication we found for this one is that it sets standards for ELLs and allows for them to have opportunities in education. This benefits them rather than just making them what they viewed as equals. And then limitations, this limited them on the time that they got to spend in the classroom, learning like English with proficient students. They weren't like getting any like special treatment, so there was no differentiation happening.
The next case that we have was the Casatinda versus Pickard of 1978. Casatinda claimed that his kids in RSD were being discriminated because of their ethnicity, and RSD failed to establish sufficient bilingual education programs. Casatinda mandated that they needed standards for ELLs, and a major outcome from this case was the 3-pronged test to determine whether schools were taking appropriate action to address the needs of ELLs. The implication we found was that the standards of Casatinda has essentially become the standard and the law of the land in determining the adequacy of the programs for the ELLs. And the limitation that we found was the court did not support the plaintiff's demand for bilingual education.
And then next we have our extra one that we picked. This is Andrew F. versus Douglas County School District 1993, sorry. So basically Drew was making very little progress in his education at public school. So his parents enrolled him in a private school so that he would become more successful in his education. And then the school district was asked to reimburse the parents for the tuition, but the school refused because they were not doing like their job how they were supposed to. And then this mandate was the mandate of the idea. And then the implication was that it maintains the responsibility of all schools in regards to if they're private or if they're public schools, just to ensure the success of all students with disabilities. And then many students with disabilities may not ever be able to live alone. So it's harder for them to set goals that are on the same level as their peers, which can make them have a little bit of self-doubt. That was our limitation.
Our next one was the Proposition 227 of 1998. The key points we found for this one were that it was placed in an inappropriate restriction on ELL students. There was an opportunity to have Proposition 227 repealed, and many jumped at the chance, and the proposition was eventually appealed. The implication we found was the Proposition 227 did little regarding to the help of ELL students in terms of bilingual education. The limitation was they restricted ELL students on the way that learning in bilingual settings.
So next we had the No Child Left Behind, which was the NCLB. It was from 2002 to 2016. So this law reauthorized the Bilingual Education Act. And so it took that out of play. And then it also was held accountable by lots of testing that was required throughout the year. And that's how they could see if the schools were actually doing this. And then the Obama administration allowed flexibility to states in meeting the NCLB standards because the standards were really high. So some implications were that it took away any words that would make others look at kids from a deficit view, which is kind of what the Bilingual Education Act was doing. And then the limitations were that tests were required by all students, but the school was marked as failing even if only the ELLs failed. And so they took all the scores, but if some kids were failing, then the school was a failing school. And then the ELLs had to take the test in English, which was opposite of what the Bilingual Education Act had fought for in the first place.
The next act that we have is the Americans with Disabilities Act Amendment of 2008. This protected all individuals with disabilities from discrimination. They also require most employers, whether it's a public or private sector, to make reasonable accommodations for them. It ensured that transportation in like buildings in the workplace and many places that were open to the public are accessible to people with disabilities. So like wheelchair ramps for people that are in wheelchairs. And then it mandated that telecommunication companies make available options for people with hearing loss and speech impairments to communicate with others. The implication we found for this was that it set standards for employers when it comes to workers with disabilities and maintained a fair and equal workplace for all people with disabilities. The limitation was that many employees with disabilities may have hard times in the workspace getting around in a timely manner, even with aid, and that it may affect jobs where tips are an important chunk of income.
So our last act was the Every Student Succeeds Act, or the ESSA, which was from 2015 and is still in effect today, and we still use it. So some of the key points were that it was signed into law by President Obama And this was after he had made changes to the NCLB because he thought that it was unfair. It was fully implemented in the 2018-2019 school year. And that's whenever every school was required to use this one. And then it's in place for all students, not just ELLs. And so some of the implications were that it maintains high standards, but more flexibility to fit students' needs in the NCLB. And this goes back to Obama making it more flexible for everyone to follow the NCLB. He just carried that over to this new act. And then the limitations were that it had high standards for testing, and that put a lot of stress on the ELLs and their teachers or schools. And so still today, testing is a big deal, and it's really stressful for everyone.